Good evening, everyone, and I'm glad you could join us today for the Brodie Lecture on Conditions of Peace. And there can be no more topic more important than this or more worthy of our attention this evening. So I want to thank everyone at the Burkle Center who brings together people to really talk about the global importance. This is an extremely important topic for us at UCLA. And these are the types of things, as a public institution, we should be involved in these types of dialogue. This is critical to our mission. So we're continuing that tradition tonight with a distinguished speaker, Congressman Adam Schiff, and we're deeply appreciative that he can be here. He's busy, and I always say it's not easy to get to Westwood, even if you live in Westwood. So we really appreciate you coming tonight. So I want to recognize the leadership, his leadership, especially in getting the Daniel Pearl Freedom of the Press Act passed and signed into law by President Obama in 2010. And thank you. As you can imagine, freedom of the press is especially important to those of us in academia, and the memory of Daniel Pearl is very important to this UCLA community, so we really appreciate that. We thank you for all the work that you do on behalf of all of us, and we really appreciate you joining in this important conversation. So now I'd like to welcome our director of the Burkle Center, Professor Cal Rustiola.
Thank you, Chancellor Block. So welcome, everyone. The Burkle Center's mission is to enrich the understanding of international affairs here at UCLA, in LA, and around the world. And as the Chancellor mentioned, one of the main ways we try to do that is to bring together thinkers, policymakers, political figures, analysts here to campus and to have a chance to meet and have dialogue with them, and that's what we're doing tonight. For 3 decades, the Bernard Brodie Distinguished Lecture on the Conditions of Peace has been an important forum for that kind of dialogue. It has a really storied past. Bernard Brodie, some of you may know, was a professor here at UCLA and a leading Cold War strategist. So this lecture honors that. We've had presidents, prime ministers, secretaries of state and defense, national security advisors, Nobel Prize winners, U.S. senators, and U.S. representatives. So today it's a great honor to welcome Congressman Adam Schiff to UCLA as the 2018 Brodie Lecturer. I think, as we know, right up there on the screen, he represents many Californians, many Angelenos. He has been instrumental in Congress on a variety of foreign affairs issues. Most notably, I think, as many of you are aware, he has been a key voice recently on the role of Russia in our election and on a host of issues around intelligence. So after I introduce him properly, he will give some brief remarks from this podium. He and I will then sit down in those chairs. Some of you have been to these before, you know how we do it. We'll have a brief conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. The congressman is going to take his own questions. So please raise your hands, of course, wait to be called on, wait for a microphone, and I urge you to keep your questions short and to the point. Adam Schiff was born in Massachusetts and moved to California in the 1980s to be a prosecutor here in Southern California. He began his political career as a state senator and was first elected to Congress in 2001. He now represents California's 28th district. Congressman Schiff serves as the ranking member on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He's also a member of the Benghazi Select Committee and is on leave from the House Appropriations Committee. He previously served on the International Relations Committee and the Judiciary Committee. While in Congress, he co-founded the Freedom of the Press Caucus, which seeks to combat media censorship and persecution around the world. Chancellor Block mentioned the Daniel Pearl Freedom of the Press Act, a really important act that makes sure that the State Department, in its annual reports on human rights around the world, notes intimidation, persecution, and other criticisms of the press, suppression of the press in the countries that it reports. For us here at the Burkle Center, as the Chancellor mentioned, the Daniel Pearl legacy is really important. We host the Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecture every year. This year we had Fareed Zakaria from CNN, so I'm particularly glad that that's something that Congressman Schiff has made a focus in his career. In addition, he has been outspoken in his efforts to revamp the 2001 authorization to use military force, which has been the primary legal authorization for our military activities in the Middle East and elsewhere since the 9/11 attacks. Long overdue for let's say, a change or revamp. He has pushed for that. Earlier this month, he introduced legislation to require any executive branch spending at Trump-owned properties to be publicly disclosed. He's been a forceful advocate for American recognition of the Armenian genocide. And over the last year, He's, of course, been a frequent news commentator on the Russia investigation. In what I'm going to surmise is a badge of honor, President Trump has called Adam Schiff sleazy and totally biased. So, Congressman, keep up the good work. Congressman Schiff graduated from Stanford and Harvard Law School. He and his wife, Eve, have 2 children, Alexa and Elijah. Please join me in welcoming to UCLA, Adam Schiff.
Cal, thank you very much. Chancellor, thank you for inviting me. It's a delight to be here, and I'll never forget picking up my son at camp after the president had called me sleazy Adam Schiff. And the nice thing about camp is they take away your electronics, so I knew I was going to be the first, or I wanted to be the first to tell him so that he didn't hear from classmates when he went back to school. And so when my wife and I picked him up, we said, Eli, I want you to know something that happened while you were at camp. It's not a big deal, but the president called your dad sleazy. And that's normally a big thing for a president of the United States to say about somebody. But he thought about this for a moment, then he looked at me and he said, can I call you sleazy? And I said, only if you want me to call you sleazy Jr. But let's face it, these are strange times. These are strange and dangerous times. And I'll give you a perfect illustration of the point. I was on the House floor about a month and a half ago when one of my colleagues came up to me and asked me what I thought of Michael Bolton being named National Security Advisor. And I said, well, I think you mean John Bolton. Michael Bolton is a singer, but actually I would be perfectly good with Michael Bolton. I might sleep better with Michael Bolton. But that is where we are. And I thought tonight that I would maybe talk briefly about the challenges that we face from North Korea, Iran, and Russia, and then we can discuss any of those challenges or any others that you have in mind. Let me start with Iran, and obviously the challenge we face from Iran and North Korea is not unrelated. The Iran nuclear deal, and in the interest of disclosure, I was a supporter of the deal. It is not that I thought that the deal was a perfect deal, and you'll never make a perfect deal with an adversary. But it did have a number of important benefits in terms of nonproliferation and in terms of our security and global security. And chief among them were the fact that at the time that we entered into negotiations with Iran, Iran was several weeks away from being able to have enough enriched uranium to build a bomb. Now, they were still probably a year away from having the mechanism for the bomb. When you consider, and Chancellor Carnazal is one of the experts here, I'm a little intimidated to talk about nonproliferation with you here, but there are really 2 timelines. One is how long does it take you to enrich the material, another is how long does it take you to build the device. And in the case of Iran, when we entered into these discussions, Iran was about a year away in terms of device, and about a matter of anywhere from 6 to 8 or maybe 12 weeks away from being able to enrich to a sufficient degree and a sufficient amount for a nuclear weapon. And what we had been doing had not been a sufficient deterrent to curtail that program, and we were headed in a direction in which military conflict looked like a likely outcome if we were going to stop Iran from going beyond where it was. Now, the agreement had the benefit of elongating the time for enrichment by forcing Iran to export the vast majority of its enriched material, by forcing Iran to take offline its centrifuges and prohibited them from deploying a new generation of faster spinning, more efficient centrifuges. It forced them to pour concrete into their plutonium reactor at Arak. And it required Iran to submit to the most intensive inspection regime of any nation in terms of its nuclear program. The downside of the agreement was that some of its provisions were not indefinite in duration. And so in a matter of 10 or 15 or 20 years, they were allowed to bring online a new generation of centrifuges And that would allow them to get back to where they were at the beginning of the negotiations, in the sense that they could be weeks away from the capability of enriching uranium sufficient to make a bomb. But the prohibition on developing the mechanism is indefinite. They're never allowed to have a weapons program. And so that 1 year breakout time in terms of weaponization should never be less than a year. Now, that requires us to be able to devote our intelligence and other resources to making sure that they comply. Because if Iran was going to cheat, they'd be far more likely to cheat on the weaponization than on the enrichment. It's hard to hide an enrichment program. It is more easy to hide, I think, certain aspects of developing the device. But nonetheless, in my view, on balance, it was far preferable to the alternative. And the alternative in the direction we were heading was Iran either with a very short breakout period or another military confrontation in the region. Even those, however, that were opposed to the agreement, many of those opposed to the agreement, including a number of my Democratic colleagues in Congress, thought that once having entered into the agreement, it would be a profound mistake to leave the agreement, particularly when Iran was abiding by the agreement, and from everything we could tell, Iran was abiding by the agreement. But nonetheless, the president has pulled us out of the agreement. He has expressed his intention to snap back not only our own sanctions, but to impose secondary sanctions on our European allies if they don't decide to renege on the deal in the same way that we have. Now, this, of course, puts our European allies in a horrible position of either being forced to essentially violate an agreement that they also entered into that Iran was complying with, or being at odds with the United States and also potentially the subject of our own sanctions. And here's the risk besides the obvious one in which the United States ends up isolating itself rather than Iran, and that is by the overuse of sanctions, should it come to that, by our use of sanctions even against our own allies, we risk accelerating a movement which is already somewhat underway, and that is to develop an alternative system to that of what's called SWIFT, one of the clearinghouse international systems for financial transactions, in which, if an alternative is developed with Chinese or other leadership, our ability to enforce our sanction in the future is greatly diminished. This one important, powerful tool that we have to effectuate policy without the necessity of going to war could be very seriously undermined. So I think it was a terrible mistake. I think, unfortunately, but not surprisingly, it's a mistake driven by a president whose overriding objective is to obliterate the legacy of his predecessor, no matter the cost. But that was the decision he made. Now, it's bad enough to make the decision, in my view. It's worse to make it before you even get a deal with North Korea. But that's also where we are. So he's given the North Koreans far less reason to believe that even if they do reach an agreement with us, that either he will keep the agreement or that anyone who comes after him will keep the agreement. And here's another aspect of, I think, the dangerous precedent that this president has set, and that is it has been the tradition of the country that the president speaks for the country. And an agreement reached by the president is an agreement that will be honored by the next president. But that has been shattered, which means that in the future, in any negotiation in which we enter into, other parties, our allies and adversaries alike, need to wonder whether that agreement will outlive that particular president. And that's a problem. So it makes it more difficult, I think, to get to yes with the North Koreans, which is not going to be easy to begin with. But also, I think it has only increased the degree to which the North Koreans believe that this president needs a nuclear deal with them more than they do. And when I look at the choreography of what we've seen over the last few months, what it looks like to me is the North Koreans realized they had the President of the United States over a barrel. Having walked out of the Iran agreement, having essentially touted his ability to get a deal with North Korea as the great deal maker, they were in the position to call the shots. And effectively, it seemed to be working, with the president guaranteeing the personal security and protection of the regime The president saying that Kim Jong-un was going to be very, very happy with the deal. I mean, since when does a president of the United States talk this way about a foreign despot? But this is where we are. And I think the North Koreans concluded that this president is so desperate for a deal, and just the carrot of his supporters out there saying he deserves the Nobel Prize, only added, I think, to the North Korean sense that he is so desperate for a deal, he'll take anything we offer. Now, I think the White House understood this eventually. Too late, but nonetheless understood this. And I think probably this more than anything else accounted for their decision to say, we're calling off the summit, which I think tactically was the right thing to do, to at least try to establish that we're prepared to walk away. But nonetheless, I think that the president has given Kim Jong-un every reason to believe that if he can get anything that he can claim as a win, that the North Koreans may very well get what they want. And what do the North Koreans want? The North Koreans want to keep their nuclear program. The North Koreans want to keep their missile program. And the North Koreans want out from under sanctions. So the ideal deal for the North Koreans is something that looks like nonproliferation, it looks like denuclearization, that gets them out from under sanctions but actually doesn't require them to give up anything. And this is what we have to be concerned about a deal. And that is it really a deal in America's interest? Is it really a deal at all? Is it really denuclearization? Or is it essentially buying a promise of future denuclearization? Because what the North Koreans have often meant by denuclearization in the past is, sure, we'll give up our nukes after you do. Or we'll give up our nukes after you pull all your troops out of the peninsula. Or we'll give up our nukes after you give us everything we want economically. You go first. These are some of the dangers, and of course the biggest pitfall of all is if the president doesn't get what he wants, and let's face it, after the justification he gave for pulling out of the Iran deal, that the Iran deal was a terrible deal, the worst deal in the history of deals, and the inspection regime, which was the strongest we've ever entered into, was a weak inspection regime. That means that in theory, he's going to need something far stronger than that with North Korea. He's going to need anytime, any place inspections anywhere in North Korea, which the North Koreans are very unlikely to agree to. And the concern, of course, is that the alternative, if this thing blows up, and there's certainly a great chance that it may, is the president immediately concludes there's no alternative but to go to war. So these are some of the dangers and the risks that we face with Iran. Now may conclude, if the Europeans do in fact reimpose some sanctions, that the economic benefits that they were promised aren't sufficient to justify their remaining in the agreement. And if Iran goes back to enriching, what can we expect of our allies? We certainly can't expect much of Russia and China. And so we may be in the worst of all situations where Iran is back to enriching and Iran is back to doing business with much of the world, just not with us, and maybe not as much with Europe, but we have effectively a weakened sanctions regime and Iran once again on the path to enrichment. So these are the two, I think, interlocking challenges of North Korea and Iran right now. Now let me turn to Russia. I think that many people make a mistake when they consider what Russia is all about, Democrats and Republicans. Certainly the president would have us believe that, well, it's just a hoax. It's a witch hunt. We don't even know whether the Russians did it. It could have been the Chinese. The only one who's apparently off the hook by now is that 400-pound fat guy, because we don't hear about him anymore. But this is someone who wants us to believe that we really don't even know if the Russians did it, that it was necessary for the President of the United States to ask Vladimir Putin, did you do it? She literally did. She literally did. And to assure us that we could trust that Vladimir Putin, this former KGB operative, would be truthful about this, the president came back to assure us he not only asked Putin, he asked him twice. because apparently not even the most hardened KGB hand can lie more than once in a row. So we have that to take comfort in. But even among Democrats, there's a tendency, I think, to think that this was just about harming Hillary Clinton or helping Donald Trump. Now, it's certainly true that the Russians had a preferred candidate in Donald Trump. This was someone who spoke disparagingly of NATO, someone who encouraged Brexit and further weakening of Europe, someone who was willing to make common cause with the Russians in Syria, where our interests are not at all aligned, and most significant, someone who was willing to do away with sanctions on Russia over its invasion of its neighbor. You cannot chart out a more favorable candidate from the Russian perspective. And the icing, of course, on the cake is this is someone who is threatening to blow up the transatlantic alliance, which he has gone to great lengths, sadly, since taking office to do. So this was a dream candidate from the Russian perspective, and of course with Hillary Clinton, that they had every reason to be concerned. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, did what we would expect our Secretary of State to do, and that is when the Russians had fraudulent elections in 2011, she spoke out on the right of people everywhere, including in Russia, to participate in legitimate elections, to be able to choose their representatives. And for Putin, he considered this a direct threat to his regime. Indeed, for Putin, the color revolutions are the secret handiwork of the CIA and the State Department. The Arab Spring is the work of the CIA. When I'm with the CIA, which is frequently in my job, I will often congratulate them on their omnipotence. Apparently, they do everything around the world. Not all of it goes great, but they're responsible for it all, apparently. But this is the Russian perspective. And in that perspective, Hillary Clinton is very much a threat. Putin doesn't worry about losing a democratic election. If you're a viable opponent of the Kremlin, you end up in jail or dead or disqualified from running, which was the case with his last opponent, disqualified from running, which also makes it all the more mysterious how you could possibly call to congratulate Putin in an election in which he precluded his opponent from running, which the president, of course, did. I don't know if you saw one of the articles this week, or maybe it was last week, about H.R. McMaster and how they had to keep essentially dumbing down the president's daily brief, which is what most presidents historically have gotten, which is a lengthy document that informs the president each day of the threats around the world and what we know about them. For those in the intelligence community, making it into the president's daily brief is the gold standard. And they were quickly told, no, you've got to put it maybe on a single piece of paper or maybe two. And then they were told, okay, now you need to put it on a card. And so the card that day, apparently for the president, his instructions in his conversation with Putin, it said all in caps, do not congratulate. And according to this article, which seems all too credible, one of the senior White House aides said to McMaster, who may have produced that card, you know he's going to congratulate him anyway. And H.R. McMaster's response is, of course he is. But you have to wonder what that conversation looks like. Hey, Vladimir, well done. Great job winning that election. Really love how you didn't let your opponent run. Thinking about doing that in the United States as well. Seems like a great idea. Huge. I can't even visualize that conversation. But I think we have to realize that far beyond having a preference for a candidate, the more fundamental objective of the Russians was to sow discord in the United States, to pit Americans against other Americans, something you can see so demonstrably in the Facebook advertising that the Russians covertly did. But more than that, their aim was to weaken the fabric of our democracy. And not just our democracy, but democracies all over the world. What the Russians did here, they have been doing in Europe for a long time. And I think we really need to pay attention to the fact that this is going on at a time when there is a real challenge to the very idea of liberal democracy. A time when the autocrats around the world are on the rise. You cannot look around the world right now and escape the terrible conclusion that the autocrats are on the rise. You see a rise in the far-right parties in Europe. You see a rise in authoritarianism in places like Hungary and in Poland. You see it in Turkey with Erdogan, and in terms of freedom of the press now, Turkey is the leading jailer of journalists in the world. You see it in the Philippines with Duterte, where they're engaged in a mass campaign of extrajudicial killing. All around the world, you see a real rise of the autocrats. And I think for all of us in this room that have grown up in the post-World War II era, in which year after year after year, we were the beneficiaries of a world that was ever increasing in its freedoms, with more people with a free press, more people able to practice their faith, more people able to associate with whom they would or love the person they loved, we felt like this was an inexorable law of nature. That, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Only to find it is not bending towards justice, not today. And this is the far broader context that I think we need to be mindful of when we think about what the Russians are up to. That there is a real challenge to the very idea of liberal democracy. We've historically been the champions of that ideal. And sadly, I think around the world, people look to the United States now, they look to the Oval Office, and they don't recognize what they see. They see a president who disparages his own press, a president who called the press the enemy of the people, who, and you may have lost sight of this in the flurry of things happening last week, and of course, last week was no different than the week before, the week before that. But it was revealed last week that the President of the United States was having secret meetings with the Postmaster General and trying to bludgeon her into raising the postal rates on Amazon. And why? To punish Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. Now, this comes on the heels of holding up a merger involving CNN because he doesn't like that content. Greenlighting acquisitions by Sinclair Broadcasting because he does like that content. Threatening to pull MSNBC or NBC's license because he doesn't like that content. Pulling the credentials of reporters or throwing them out of events because he doesn't like their coverage. This is not happening alone in Turkey, it's happening here. And this is one of the terrible realizations for me of the last year, and that is the threat to our democracy from without that we see from Russia is now less than the threat to our democracy from within. The threat to our democracy from a president that doesn't respect the freedom of the press, the threat to democracy from a president that doesn't respect the independence of the Justice Department, the threat to our democracy from a president who impugns the rulings of a federal judge based on their ethnic origin, the threat to our democracy from a president who does not respect our system of checks and balances. And that, to me, is among the most serious concerns we ought to have to the health of our democracy. So it's a chilling time for the country, at home and abroad. But I want you to know that in the midst of all of this, there is every reason to be optimistic. I always come back to something that Bill Clinton once said. There's nothing wrong in America that can't be cured by what's right in America. And there is an awful lot right in America that I know will get us through this. Thank you very much.
Congressman, that was a terrific start. So I want to pick up on your discussion about Russia. Given your role on the Permanent Select Committee, we happened to, on this very stage yesterday, have the CIA here, CIA representatives and the cast of The Americans. Some of you are familiar with that, just ended last night, talking about issues of espionage and so forth. One of the interesting things about The Americans as a show is when it started 6 years ago, the notion that Russia was a real threat was sort of quaint and a throwback to the Cold War. And over the course of 6 years, that became all too real. So my question to you is, did the intelligence community see this threat coming? And looking forward, are they prepared, and are we as a nation prepared for what may happen in 2018, 2020, and going forward?
Well, I think first of all, I don't think the intelligence community saw it coming that Russia was going to intervene in as ham-handed a fashion as they did. And there's been a lot of analysis since to try to determine what caused the Russians to throw caution to the winds and to become interventionists in our democracy to a degree we had never seen before. We were certainly aware early on of certain things the Russians were doing. That the Russians were involved, for example, in the hacking of democratic institutions, that the Russians were involved in hacking of think tanks and other organizations of our democracy. But I think the assumption was based on our prior history of what Russia had done, what China and other countries had done, that this was foreign intelligence gathering, that this was a foreign power that was trying to learn as much as it could, but there was no expectation that they would operationalize the data, that the data that they were stealing, that they would start dumping in such a blatant way. So that was not something I think that we predicted at all. Now, I think we very soon realized what the Russians were doing in real time. And we had difficulty, I have to say, in Congress, Senator Feinstein and I, as we saw this intelligence coming in, and of course we were being briefed by the intelligence agencies, we had trouble getting the Obama administration to take the kind of steps that we thought that they should. We urged them to make public attribution of what the Russians were doing when we were seeing it, to inform the country of what the Russians were doing. And they were very reluctant. And I think they were reluctant because you had Donald Trump out there saying that the process was rigged. And if the Obama administration was out too visibly talking about what the Russians were doing, I think they feared that that would play into Donald Trump's narrative that somehow the deep state was rigging the process. From my point of view, though, this was information the American people not only had a right to know, but a need to know, to inform their decisions, and to be able to put in perspective the information they were getting through the hacking and dumping operation. Ultimately, they made attribution, but in a way that got little or no attention. Two agency heads released a public statement, a document that was obscured by the
Access Hollywood tapes. On a Friday afternoon.
On a Friday afternoon. Now, they lament the fact that their statement got little attention, but that's not an adequate answer, because if it got too little attention, and it did, nothing precluded them from bringing more attention to it. Nothing precluded the president from talking about it. So I think that was a mistake. Now, I think the administration operated from the same flawed assumption that James Comey operated from, and that was Hillary was going to win. And if they did inform the public, and it fed into the Trump narrative that the process was rigged, that would undermine Clinton when she became president. And similarly, James Comey has said that he felt that if he didn't go public with the Anthony Weiner email situation, that it would undermine her credibility if and when she became president. But that was the wrong way to analyze the situation, and I think it's had very far-reaching and negative consequences. In terms of protecting in the next election, I don't think we're doing anywhere near what we need to do. And what would be happening in a normal presidency in an election after which a foreign adversary had hacked into our democracy is the president would be sitting down with his National Security Council, with his cabinet, and he would be demanding of each and every one of them, what are you doing to protect the country in the next election? So, Secretary of State, what are you doing to deter the Russians? What are you talking to the Russians about? Secretary of Defense, what plans what cyber response do you have in case it comes to that? Director of the CIA, what are you hearing about the Russian plans and intentions in the midterm? Director of Homeland Security, what's going on with the states? Are they taking advantage of the forensic tools you have to test their defenses and see whether they're protecting their elections infrastructure? How are you working with each other? You're talking to each other. Are we protecting our elections? None of that is happening. It's not happening, of course, because the president would never ask them to do it. But it's not happening also because they're not going to raise it with him, because he would view that as a threat to his legitimacy. And so I think that leaves us all too unprepared.
Let me ask you about Mike Pompeo. So you dealt with him as CIA director. He's now Secretary of State. Does that make you feel better that he is out of CIA and in state, and Rex Tillerson is that? Is this a positive step? What are your feelings about him going forward?
Well, I think that when he was at CIA, that the workforce respected him. I think he was a good manager of people. There were times, though, that I had deep concerns that he was not able to shed the deeply partisan character he had in the Congress. And I became most concerned when I would hear him say things like, the intelligence community concluded that the Russian interference had no effect on the outcome of the election. Now, he said this as CIA director. That's complete nonsense, and he knows it. The CIA reached no such conclusion. In fact, the CIA and the intelligence community said quite to the contrary, we reach no conclusion about the impact on the election because that's not our charter. That's beyond our scope. So when he would say things like that, when he would downplay the significance of what the Russians would do and play to the president publicly, it said to me, is this someone that has the backbone to stand up to the president privately if he's saying these things publicly? So in that respect, I think he certainly raised concerns at CIA. In terms of the State Department, there are different concerns. The concerns, I think, at the State Department are the general hawkishness of his perspective on Iran and on a number of other issues and hotspots, certainly on Korea up until the present negotiation. Those are concerns. Now, the one hope, I think, is that because he has a much better relationship with the president than Rex Tillerson did, that maybe he can reverse some of the damage being done to the department, the hollowing out of that institution. Maybe he will be a champion for the State Department, and maybe he'll have the standing to do something about it, but that's still to be determined.
You covered Iran and North Korea quite a bit in your opening remarks, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just to note, we at the Burkle Center hosted Condoleezza Rice earlier this month, and I asked her, isn't it a problem that we are erasing a deal, unraveling a deal with Iran at the same time that we were trying to get a deal with North Korea? Doesn't that create a problem for us going forward? And her answer was, no, it really doesn't, because these are two separate issues and the North Koreans understand that Iran is Iran, and basically there's not a linkage there. I take it you don't agree, and so I just would like to have you expand on that a little more. Why is she wrong?
I have to say, I'm
just paraphrasing, of course.
I'm astounded when I hear people who are as capable as she is say things like that, which are so contrary to just common sense. But if you need any proof, the fact that we might want to compartmentalize these different issues and countries and situations, but that doesn't mean that our adversaries or even our allies are going to be willing to do so. Look at the North Korean reaction to the suggestion that we use the Libya model. They're obviously aware that that's not a particularly great model for them. And so they think about what our experience has been with other countries. The fact that we had a deal with Libya and Muammar Gaddafi ended up 6 feet under, and we're touting this as a model, is not something that has escaped their attention, and they certainly aren't oblivious to what the president did vis-a-vis Iran. So it doesn't mean that a deal with North Korea is impossible, but it inescapably means it's much more difficult. And so I can't understand the logic of the contrary argument, except that it may be a desire not to frontally attack or disagree with the administration on this issue. But to me, it seems a pretty inescapable conclusion.
Let me pivot to China. So you mentioned a little bit about China earlier in the day. We know that in terms of cyber capabilities, Russia and China are two of the most formidable adversaries that we have. Russia has shown a special talent for disinformation operations and interference in internal politics in a way that we didn't conventionally think was going to be the primary threat. Are you concerned that China may do the same things, or do you think they will pose a different set of challenges? How do you see China fitting into that?
Well, I think China poses a different set of cyber challenges. I would be very surprised if China decided after the blowback from the Russia intervention that this was a good idea for China to do. But I think China has concluded that there are other levers that they can pull that are going to be much more effective. I discussed this with some of the student journalists earlier this evening, but the Chinese may very well have concluded the best way to win over a U.S. policy is by investing in Trump-branded properties. Because apparently the same week that the president abruptly changed course on sanctions over ZTE was the same week China decided to commit $500 million to Trump-branded property in Indonesia. I can tell you this, there's no way in the world Ivanka would have gotten her brands or trademarks in China had the president fall through on his campaign promise to revisit one China policy. So not only China, but other nations around the world, and this has been the subject, I think, of ample public reporting, view financial leverage as an entree to the administration, as a lever that can be used with the first family. This is, of course, the exact problem the Emoluments Clause was designed to protect against. But what we are finding in this administration, much to our surprise, is that these constitutional provisions are not self-effectuating. They require not only an engaged public, but they also require a Congress that is dedicated to our institutions and the Constitution itself. And at this moment, you have to say that the Congress is largely failing to live up to its responsibility. There's been no hearing on the Chinese investment in the Trump-branded property, and there won't be. The chairman of the Government Reform Committee, who brought us the endless Benghazi investigations, and by the way, I'm going to have to make sure that that's removed from any bio, because that committee I'm no longer affiliated with, and happily so.
I know you were a critic of it all along.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you how we got on that select committee on Benghazi. At the time that committee was announced, I was invited to be on Chris Wallace's Sunday morning program, and I said that I feared that this select committee on Benghazi, which would be the 8th investigation of Benghazi in Congress, would be a purely political object meant to tear down Hillary Clinton, and the Democrats should have nothing to do with it. Now I can tell you, going on sort of the Fox flagship program and saying that you shouldn't participate in another umpteenth Benghazi investigation was like putting your arm in a beehive and going like this. And we had to give our interns answering the phones hazard pay that week. But my reward for saying we should have nothing to do with it was being asked to serve on the darn thing. But the guy who chaired that, Trey Gowdy, is also the guy who's now the chair of the Government Reform Committee that in an ordinary world, in a Congress doing its job world, would be looking into the daily, weekly violations of the Emoluments Clause, would be helping the Congress of the United States understand whether U.S. policy was being bought and sold. And none of that is happening. And none of it will happen as long as they control the Congress. I would expect China to continue to use its financial leverage, to leverage the first family. I would expect China to continue to engage in cyber hacking for foreign intelligence gathering. I would expect China to continue to engage in cyber for the purposes of stealing for economic benefit, but maybe in a diminished way. One of the rules of the road the Obama administration tried to develop with China was an agreement that we shall not spy for economic gain. And President Xi agreed to this. And we have seen, I think, some diminution in the cyber espionage for the purposes of economic gain. But we don't know yet whether that's only because they're hiding their hand better or whether they're really adopting this as a norm. But I think that we have to expect, certainly when it comes to the development of certain technologies and any technologies of a military application, that this will continue to be a very high Chinese priority.
Your indictment of Congress is pretty severe. You basically just said that there's nothing that they will really do to check a president who may go off in a number of different directions that are detrimental to our national welfare. Now, the constitutional order presumes that Congress has a lot of power and can ultimately, and will ultimately check the president, but that's not how it's working. So do you believe that that system is irrevocably broken, or do you think there is a way that Congress can come back into its intended role as a check on the executive?
Well, and you can write this off to my party affiliation, but I think short of the majority changing hands in the Congress, there is little likelihood the Congress will stand up to this president. This has been one of the other terrible realizations for me of the last year and a half, and that has been not what kind of a President Donald Trump would turn out to be, which I think was sadly all too predictable, but how pliant the Congress would be. How quickly a deeply flawed human being could remake an entire political party in their image. And I don't understand my colleagues in Congress. You know, at one level, you can rationalize it. My GOP colleagues don't want a Trump primary challenge, or maybe they want an appointment someday, although who would want to be appointed to the Trump administration, I don't really know. But from the broader perspective, I just don't get it. What's the point of being there if you're not going to do what the country needs when the country needs you to do it? What's the point of being there? Speaker Ryan is a very personable individual, but I don't understand him at all. The institution really needs him now. When he was asked, what do you think about the president suggesting that we should pull NBC's license? You would expect a forceful response to that, I would hope, from anyone of either party. And his answer was, I'm a conservative constitutionalist who supports the First Amendment, and I have nothing further to say. And then he ran away. I guess a conservative constitutionalist means someone who is conservative in their support for the Constitution when it's not particularly convenient. That's the only thing I can gather. And apparently it's not that convenient for a great many of my colleagues. The very few who have spoken out are largely not running for re-election. And I don't think it's the case that you couldn't get re-elected if you did the right thing. I think they're just scared. And it's a terrible tragedy. I always like to joke with my constituents, the job of a congressman is not to get re-elected. It's to do the right thing and still find a way to get re-elected. I think that when they write this chapter of history, they'll have some very harsh words, obviously, for the President of the United States, but they'll have a lot of harsh words for the complicity of Congress in what he's done to the country.